And I'm delighted to say that to discuss this with me, I'm joined now by Lord Gavin Barwell, who was Theresa May's Chief of Staff. Gavin, really great to see you. Do you agree that the Prime Minister is potentially cornered by this key issue of trust?
Yes, I think the combination of that and extreme frustration among his MPs that on the Owen Paterson affair, on parties in Downing Street and on the redecoration of his flat, these are self-inflicted wounds. Sometimes political parties, like on COVID restrictions, have divisions, but they're about serious and complicated issues of public policy. And I think over the last few weeks, his MPs have been taking a lot of flack from their constituents about things that are entirely self-inflicted.
For him, you sat there, and I said almost a throwaway line in the introduction, you sat there alongside Theresa May, loyally as she was pounded for nothing has changed and the rest of it, and eventually there was no escape route for her. Do you think there is one for Boris Johnson?
I think it's possible, but I think it will depend on two things. First, he's going to have to change his ways, change the style of the government that he leads, because if he keeps on making these unforced errors, his MPs are going to ultimately lose patience with him. But secondly, I think something you said in your introduction there was spot on, which is the Tory party isn't sentimental. And more than probably any previous leader, he depends for his position on the perception that he is an asset when it comes to winning elections. And if the polls stay in the way that they have been over the last 24, 48 hours for a prolonged period, then that judgment will change among his MPs and you will see a change in leader.
Yeah. I mean, some senior figures are saying he's got until the new year.
So I doubt the timescale is that short. I mean, we'll have to see. It depends if more revelations come out. We'll have to see what comes out of the Cabinet Secretary's report, and we'll have to see what Lord Geidt does in relation to the issues in relation to the flat that you were just talking about. But what I think you can say is that this feels like an inflection point. It's got to be the worst week that he's had during his time in Number 10. And it really depends on whether the switch in the polls we've seen, both the party voting intentions, which you just showed on your graphic, but also the quite significant percentage of the public that are saying at the moment that he should resign as Prime Minister. If those stick for a period of several months, then I think the situation becomes much more difficult.
Yeah. I tell you what I think, Gavin, as well, would be utterly explosive, would be any evidence that Plan B was nothing more than a diversion from all of those other problems, parties, refurbishments, allegations of giving false evidence. If the threat from Omicron is as bad as the medics say it is, then the edicts get ignored because people don't trust him anymore. That could be literally fatal.
Yeah, so I think that there's two issues, as you say. That if anyone ever were able to demonstrate that the timing of this was purely for tactical reasons, that would be extremely serious, as you say. Actually, my biggest concern about what's happened this week is that personally, I think they've made the right judgment on Omicron. But exactly as you say, the Prime Minister's authority, his ability to convince people to do what he's asking has been very seriously damaged by the parties. And the danger is that if people don't listen to what they're being asked to do, and the situation does get as bad as the scientists fear, then we've got even worse restrictions coming our way down the line.
We're agreed 100% on that, Gavin, and thank you for so doing. And I didn't interrupt. Safe to say Lord Geidt, who you mentioned in passing there, is, of course, the senior gentleman, ex-Buckingham Palace, who is the officer commanding standards, to whom it is alleged the Prime Minister didn't tell the whole and undiluted truth. Thanks. I want to change tack slightly for the last few minutes that we've got, Gavin, if I may. One of his other problems, and you will be very familiar with this because it's DNA Tory stuff, other members of the party at the moment just don't think that he's a Tory anymore. High tax, high spending, net zero growth and an authoritarian.
So I think that the tax and spend issue is a really difficult one for the government. So first of all, we need to understand why is tax and spending high. So it's partly the pandemic. You know, the government is having to spend more at the moment to deal with that. And it did some permanent damage to our economy, opened up what economists would call a structural deficit, and the Chancellor had to plug that. But it's partly because this is a different kind of Conservative Party today than the Conservative Party of David Cameron or certainly of John Major or Margaret Thatcher. The voter coalition that is sustaining this Conservative government is a different one to the traditional Conservative one. When I first got involved in politics in the 1990s, socioeconomic class was a very strong predictor of how people voted, and it's not now. So there's the Tory party has got less middle class Southern support. It's got more support from working class voters in the Midlands and the North, and that is going to have some impact on its policies. So traditional Tories don't like it. They want to go back to the sort of low tax, small state Thatcherite approach. But that isn't going to work for the electoral coalition that the Conservative Party now has. Now, look, I think Rishi Sunak is under real pressure to find some way to reduce the tax burden by the next election. But he's not going to do that by cutting spending. So the answer has to be to find ways to get our economy to grow more strongly, to get a sort of growth agenda that grows the overall size of the cake so that a smaller proportion of the cake needs to be taken by the government in terms of public spending.
Yeah. You mentioned Rishi, and I'll add another, and that's Liz Truss, to my final question, and that is that I love the expression X is on manoeuvres, i.e. a senior figure is vying up another position, and in this case, if, and I'm very conscious of your very crisp and authoritative, I should say, analysis earlier on, if a vacancy were to emerge, is there a challenger, be it Rishi Sunak or be it Liz Truss, literally on manoeuvres in a tank the other day, fantastic imagery, around whom they could all unite? I mean, you and I will remember those funny days where someone like John Major comes through the middle as the unpredicted one because they couldn't agree on A and they couldn't agree on B, and suddenly somebody is conjured up from nowhere. Is there a challenger they could unite behind?
So, I think it's really important to note that the rules have changed. So it doesn't work how it used to work. You used to have someone challenge the leader of the party. That's not the case anymore. You now have a vote of confidence in the leader if enough MPs send in a letter to Graham Brady. And if the leader loses that vote of confidence, they're finished. And then you have an election to choose a successor. But if you're asking me, who would the runners or riders be in any leadership election, my guess would be there's at least 4 potential candidates I can think of, which would be the 2 people you've mentioned, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, Liz Truss, Foreign Secretary, Saj Javid, the Health Secretary, and then possibly, I think, Jeremy Hunt, who obviously came second to Boris Johnson in the last leadership election, and for some reason that very few people can understand, hasn't been brought back into government since.
Fascinating, yeah, and has made a big footprint throughout the COVID in his role as chair of that select committee. The final question, and you can draw everything together that you just said there at the end about runners and riders and what have you. In terms of the starter moving towards his or her position with the flag and what have you, how important is North Shropshire in that by-election on Thursday next?
So I think I don't think it's decisive, but it's clearly significant. I mean, the party number 10 will argue, well, this was a very difficult by-election because of the circumstances behind it. So you would probably expect to see a result that wasn't as good as the one that they achieved in Bexley the other day. But the Prime Minister has had the worst run during the course of this week in terms of the news agenda that he's had during his time in number 10. Losing a by-election would not help. And as I said, we've also got Cabinet Secretary's report and we've got Lord Geit's reaction to the Electoral Commission report in terms of the refurbishment of the flat. So there's a number of things in the pipeline that can make this situation even worse for the Prime Minister than it already is.
Gavin, great to see you. Thanks for breaking into your Friday evening to come and talk to us. I know you've had a busy day already. Thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. Thanks.
Pleasure.
That's Lord Barwell, Gavin Barwell, former Member of Parliament and in his own right, and former Chief of Staff to Theresa May at number 10 Downing Street with his thoughts on the Boris Johnson situation.